The gavel fell with a sound like a breaking bone. It was a clean, final crack that echoed in the cavernous, half-empty auction hall. For the two people standing near the back, a man and a woman dressed in clothes that were expensive but now looked merely tired, the sound was the punctuation mark at the end of their lives. For the old woman sitting alone in the front row, it was the period at the end of a very long, very carefully constructed sentence. She didn't flinch. She didn't smile. Her hands, resting on the handle of a simple leather purse, remained perfectly still. "Sold," the auctioneer announced, his voice booming with practiced, impersonal enthusiasm. To the lady in the front. All eyes turned to her. Dorothy Miller, 81 years old. She wore a simple navy blue dress, tailored and immaculate. Her white hair was pinned in a neat chignon. She looked like someone's grandmother, which she was. She looked like she should be at home, tending to a garden or baking cookies. She did not look like a woman who had just systematically dismantled the lives of her two children and purchased their ruined empires for pennies on the dollar. The man at the back, Mark, stared, his face a mask of disbelief. His mouth hung slightly open. The woman, Jessica, seemed to shrink into herself, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of the last 6 months had finally crushed her spine. They saw their mother, but they didn't see her. They saw a ghost from a past they had tried to bury, a ghost who had somehow risen up not to haunt them, but to evict them. Dorothy calmly took a pen from the auction official and signed the documents for the first house. Then the second. Her signature was steady, the elegant, looping script of a woman who had spent 40 years as a bookkeeper, a woman for whom every line and every number had to be precise. Her children thought she was fading, a relic succumbing to the gentle fog of age. They were wrong. She wasn't fading. She was calculating. But to understand how Dorothy Miller, a woman her children had committed to a cheap nursing home under false pretenses, came to own the very houses they lived in, you have to go back. You have to go back 6 months, to a quiet living room that smelled of lemon polish and old books, and to a betrayal that started, as so many do, with the words, "We're only thinking of you." Dorothy and Frank Miller had been married for 53 years. Theirs was a love story written not in poetry, but in sawdust and ledger books. Frank was a carpenter, a master of his trade. He could coax wood into any shape, his hands reading the grain like a blind man reading Braille. Dorothy was a bookkeeper for a small, family-owned construction firm. She understood numbers. She understood that stability wasn't built on grand gestures, but on small, consistent, daily additions. Their life together was a testament to that philosophy. They had bought a small plot of land in a budding suburb back when it was still mostly fields and promises. They didn't buy a house. They built one. Frank framed the walls, laid the floors, and hung the doors. Dorothy managed the budget, paid the suppliers, and kept the records with an almost religious devotion. The house rose around them, a physical manifestation of their partnership. Every nail was a decision, every balanced column in her ledger a guarantee for their future. Inside that house, they raised their 2 children, Mark and Jessica. They provided. They gave them everything they hadn't had: university educations, paid for first cars, down payments on their first apartments. Mark, ambitious and slick, went into real estate development. Jessica, sharp and clinical, became a corporate lawyer. They were successful. They were polished. They moved in circles their parents could barely imagine, worlds of glass towers and leveraged assets. To Dorothy and Frank, their children's success was a source of quiet pride, but also a source of a strange, unspoken distance. Mark and Jessica spoke a different language, the language of portfolios and acquisitions and billable hours. Frank, a man who believed in the value of what you could hold in your hand, never quite trusted it. "It's all paper, Dottie," he'd say, sitting at the kitchen table he'd built himself. "Just paper and promises." Frank passed away on a Tuesday in April, 2 years before the auction. His decline had been long and slow, a gradual fading that Dorothy had managed with the same steady competence she applied to everything. She nursed him, managed his medications, and held his hand as the man who had built their world slowly left it. After he was gone, the house became quiet. Too quiet. The silence was a presence, a heavy blanket that smothered the memories. But Dorothy carried on. She was lonely, but she was not helpless. She managed the bills. She tended the garden Frank had planted. She drove herself to the grocery store and the library. She lived a life of quiet, ordered routine. She was self-sufficient. Her children, however, chose to see it differently. They saw fragility. They saw a problem to be managed. The visit came on a Sunday afternoon. Mark's silver sedan and Jessica's black SUV were parked in the driveway, looming and out of place next to Dorothy's 10-year-old compact car. They sat in the living room, the same room where they had opened Christmas presents and done their homework. They didn't look at the family photos on the mantel. They looked at their mother with expressions of deep, practiced concern. "Mother," Jessica began, her voice smooth and reasonable, the same voice she used to depose uncooperative witnesses. "We've been worried about you." Mark nodded, leaning forward, his hands clasped. "All alone in this big house. It's too much for you, Mom. We just want you to be safe. We want you to be looked after." Dorothy looked from one to the other. She saw the concern in their faces, but beneath it, she sensed something else. An impatience, a resolve. It was like watching a play where the actors had already decided on the final act. "I'm perfectly fine," Dorothy said, her voice clear. "The house is not too big. It's my home. But what if you fell?" Mark pressed. "Who would know? We think it's time to consider a community. A place with people your own age. Activities. Meals prepared for you. A wonderful place," Jessica added quickly. "Top-notch. It would give us such peace of mind." They talked for over an hour. Their words were a soft, relentless tide, eroding her protests. They used her love for them as a weapon. "Don't you want us to stop worrying? Don't you think you owe it to us to be safe?" They made her feel like her independence was a form of selfishness. Finally, exhausted and heartsore, she felt her defenses crumble. They presented her with a sheaf of papers. "Just for a trial stay, Mom," Mark said, his smile bright and reassuring. "Just to see if you like it. These are just the standard intake forms." Jessica handed her a pen. "It's just to authorize us to handle things while you're settling in." Dorothy looked at the dense blocks of text. Her eyes, not as sharp as they once were, struggled with the fine print. She saw the words, "power of attorney," but they were buried in a paragraph about medical consent. She trusted them. They were her children. She had changed their diapers and paid for their degrees. She signed where Jessica's manicured finger pointed. The next morning, they came back. They had a single suitcase packed for her. A few changes of clothes, a book, her toiletries. "You won't need much for the trial," Jessica said, avoiding her eyes. They drove her. They didn't take the highway toward the nice suburbs where the top-notch communities were. They drove into an older, more industrial part of the county. They pulled up in front of a squat, two-story brick building with a small, uninspired sign that read Golden Meadows Senior Living. It did not look wonderful. It looked like a place where hope went to expire. They walked her inside. The air was thick with the smell of institutional disinfectant, a chemical sharpness that failed to mask an underlying scent of stale food and infirmity. A tired-looking woman at a reception desk barely looked up. Mark and Jessica didn't stay long. They gave her a quick, awkward hug. "We'll call you tomorrow," Mark promised. "We'll come visit in a couple of days, once you're settled." They left. Dorothy stood in the drab, narrow hallway, holding her small suitcase. She watched their cars pull away through the smudged glass of the front door. She was 81 years old, and she had just been disposed of. The reality of Golden Meadows was a slow, creeping horror. Her room was small, the size of a closet in her own home. The silence of her house was replaced by a constant cacophony. The blare of a television from the common room, the rattling of medication carts, the moans of a neighbor who was lost in the fog of dementia. The days bled into one another, a smear of bland meals and forced bingo games. The staff were not cruel, for the most part. They were just overwhelmed and underpaid, their faces etched with a permanent exhaustion. They moved with a mechanical efficiency that left no room for kindness. Dorothy felt herself becoming invisible, another task to be completed, another body to be fed and medicated. She tried calling her children. Mark's calls went straight to voicemail. Jessica would answer, but her voice was always rushed. "I'm just heading into a meeting, Mother. Is everything okay?" "Good. I'll call you back later." She never did. The promised visits never materialized. An excuse about a business trip. An excuse about a big case. The excuses were as flimsy as the sheets on her bed. Dorothy felt a despair so profound it was like a physical weight in her chest. She had been erased. Her life, her home, her very identity had been taken from her, and she had handed her children the pen to do it. She would sit by her window for hours, staring at the parking lot, feeling her mind grow as dull and gray as the gravel outside. The blow that finally shattered her despair into something harder, something sharper, came from an unexpected source. It came from a young nurse's aide named Maria. Maria was different from the others. She was quiet and shy, but she had kind eyes. She would sometimes linger in Dorothy's room for an extra minute, fluffing her pillow or making sure her water glass was full. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after Dorothy had arrived, Maria was helping her change her sheets. She was chattering quietly, mostly to herself, about her day. "The traffic was awful coming in," she said. "I had to drive past that big new development on Oak Street. You know, the one near that pretty old house with the big porch. I saw a for sale sign go up there this morning. It's a beautiful house. The listing photos online are gorgeous." Dorothy went still. Her house was on Oak Street. Her house had a big porch. "What did the sign say?" she asked, her voice a near whisper. Maria looked up, startled by the intensity in Dorothy's tone. I don't know. The real estate company. Miller something? No, wait. Millman. Millman Properties, I think. Millman Properties. That was Mark's company." The world tilted. The sickly yellow walls of the room seemed to press in on her. Her children hadn't just put her here to keep her safe. They had put her here to get her out of the way. They were selling her home. They were selling Frank's legacy. They were selling the 53 years of love and labor that had been poured into that house, and they were doing it through Mark's own company. The despair in Dorothy's chest did not vanish. It crystallized. It cooled and hardened into a single, diamond-sharp point of rage. It was the coldest, purest anger she had ever felt in her life. They had underestimated her. They had treated her like a piece of old furniture to be put into storage. They thought her mind was as frail as her body. They had forgotten who she was. She was Dorothy Miller, the bookkeeper, and the books were not balanced. For 3 days, Dorothy did nothing. She ate her bland meals. She sat in her chair. She stared at the wall. But she wasn't fading. She was thinking. She was planning. Her mind, which had felt so sluggish and foggy, was now clear and sharp. The problem was immense. She was trapped. She had no money, no phone, no autonomy. Her children held legal power over her. She was, for all intents and purposes, a prisoner. But as she sat there, methodically analyzing her situation, a memory surfaced. It was a memory of Frank from the last few months of his life. He had been sitting in his favorite armchair, his breathing shallow. He had called her over. His hand, thin and papery, had pressed a small, cold, brass key into her palm. "Dottie," he had rasped, his voice a shadow of its former self. "I want you to have this. It's for a box. At the North County Credit Union. Not the big bank." The little 1 inch he had paused, gathering his strength. "This is for a real rainy day, Dottie. Not a drizzle. A flood." Frank had always been cautious. He trusted wood and nails and hard work. He did not trust banks, and he certainly did not trust their son's flashy, debt-fueled world. Over the years, on his cash side jobs, the custom cabinets, the intricate gazebos, the bookshelves built for neighbors, he had always skimmed a little off the top. Dorothy, the bookkeeper, had known, of course. She had pretended not to. It was his one secret from her, a secret she had allowed him to keep. She had assumed it was a few $1,000s, a little just-in-case fund. A flood. This was a flood. The key was still in her old purse, in the closet of her home. But the box was at the credit union. It was a lifeline, but it was on the other side of a locked door. She needed an ally. Her gaze fell on Maria. The young aide was kind, yes, but Dorothy was a pragmatist. Kindness wasn't enough. She had observed Maria for weeks. She knew Maria worked double shifts. She had seen the worn-out soles of her nursing shoes. She had overheard a hushed, tearful phone call Maria had made about her own mother's mounting medical bills. Maria wasn't just kind. She was desperate. Dorothy waited for the right moment. It came late one evening, during the quiet lull after the last medication round. Maria was emptying the small trash can in Dorothy's room. "Maria," Dorothy said, her voice low but firm. Maria turned. "Yes, Mrs. Miller. I need to hire you," Dorothy said. "Not I need your help. Not could you do me a favor? I need to hire you. It was the language of business, clear and direct. Maria blinked, confused. Hire me? I already work here. No, Dorothy said. I need to hire you for a private job. I need you to drive me to the North County Credit Union. It will take less than an hour of your time. I will pay you $1,000. In cash. Maria's eyes widened. $1,000. It was more than she made in 2 weeks of backbreaking work. She looked around nervously, down the empty hallway. Mrs. Miller, I can't. They would fire me. Your son, he has the power of attorney. I'm not allowed to take you anywhere without his permission. Dorothy leaned forward slightly in her chair. The frailty seemed to fall away from her, replaced by an iron resolve that made her seem taller, stronger. My son is not here, she said, her voice dropping even lower. You are. Your shift ends in 45 minutes. There is a shift change at 10 o'clock. It's always chaotic. No one will notice for at least an hour. I will be waiting by the service exit near the kitchens. If you are there with your car, you will earn $1,000. If you are not, I will find another way. She held Maria's gaze. In that moment, Maria didn't see a confused old woman. She saw a commander. She saw a woman who had made a decision and would not be swayed. She saw the desperation in Dorothy's eyes, and it mirrored her own. The service exit, Maria whispered, her heart pounding. 10 o'clock. She straightened up, grabbed the trash can, and walked out of the room without another word. Dorothy sat back. The first move had been made. Now, all she could do was wait and see if her investment would pay off. The 45 minutes felt like a lifetime. Dorothy changed out of her nightgown and into the simple day dress she had arrived in. She sat on the edge of her bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, listening to the sounds of the facility. The rattle of the cart, the distant cough, the hum of the fluorescent lights in the hall. Every sound was a potential discovery. At 5 minutes to 10, she stood up. Her legs were stiff. She walked to her door and peered out. The hallway was empty. The common room television was off for the night. She slipped out and began the slow, deliberate walk toward the back of the building. She kept to the shadows, her soft-soled slippers making no sound on the linoleum floor. She felt a tremor of fear, but it was overshadowed by the cold, clear purpose that now guided her every move. She reached the service exit, a heavy metal door with a small, grimy window. She peered through. The back alley was lit by a single, flickering yellow bulb. And there, just beyond the dumpster, was Maria's small, dented hatchback, its engine running. Dorothy pushed the bar on the door. It opened with a loud groan. She stepped out into the cool night air. It was the first fresh air she had breathed in a month, and it felt electric. Maria, her face pale in the dim light, pushed the passenger door open from the inside. Dorothy got in, her movements slow but steady. Maria didn't speak. She just put the car in gear and pulled out of the alley. As they drove away from Golden Meadows, Dorothy didn't look back. There was nothing there for her to see. The drive to the credit union was silent. Maria gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. Dorothy stared out the window at the passing streetlights. The world outside felt unreal, like a movie she was watching. The North County Credit Union was a small, unassuming brick building, closed for the night. But Dorothy knew it had 24-hour access to its safe deposit boxes. Maria parked in the deserted lot. The cash, Maria said, her voice trembling slightly. You said, the money is in the box, Dorothy said calmly. Wait here. She got out of the car. Her hands were shaking now, but she clenched them into fists. She walked to the small, secure entrance. She used her old bank card to open the first door, then entered the vault area. The rows of cold, steel boxes stood like silent soldiers. She walked to her row, found the number Frank had written on a slip of paper with the key. She inserted her bank key. Then she inserted Frank's key. The small door clicked open. She pulled out the long, heavy metal box. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. She carried it to a small, private viewing booth and closed the door. She lifted the lid. For a moment, she just stared. It was not a few $1,000s. The box was filled. There were thick stacks of $100 bills, bound with rubber bands. There were bearer bonds, yellowed with age. There were stock certificates for companies that Dorothy vaguely remembered Frank mentioning decades ago, small, local firms that had since been bought by larger corporations. And at the very bottom, there was a ledger. It was a simple, school-style notebook. She opened it. It was Frank's handwriting, neat and strong. It was a detailed record of every cash job he had ever done, dating back 40 years. Dates, clients, amounts paid, and amounts deposited, a lifetime of secret savings. Dorothy began to count, her bookkeeper's mind taking over. She counted quickly, methodically. When she finished, she had to sit back and catch her breath. It was an astonishing amount. Nearly $800,000. Frank, the simple carpenter, had built them a fortress, not of wood, but of cash. He had mistrusted the world, and he had been right. She took out one stack of $100 bills. $10,000. She put it in her purse. She put the ledger in her purse as well. It was the most important thing in the box. It was the proof. She locked the rest back inside the box and walked out of the credit union, her steps lighter than they had been in years. She got back into the car and counted out 10 $100 bills. She handed them to Maria. Maria stared at the money in her hand as if it were alien. "Thank you, Maria," Dorothy said. "You have done me a great service." Maria finally looked up, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. "What are you going to do now, Mrs. Miller?" "They're going to look for you." "Yes, they will," Dorothy said. "But they won't find me. Can you take me to the Landmark Hotel? It's downtown." Maria nodded, still stunned, and put the car in gear. The transaction was complete. Dorothy had her first war chest, and she had confirmed that her strategy of leveraging desperation worked. It was a grim thought, but a necessary one. The Landmark Hotel was old but respectable, a place that catered to business travelers and valued discretion. Dorothy paid for a suite for 1 week, in cash. The clerk barely batted an eye. Once in her room, a spacious, anonymous suite with a sitting area and a small kitchenette. She locked the door and slid the chain into place. For the first time in a month, she was safe. She was free. And she was very, very rich. But money was just ammunition. She needed a general. The next morning, she went back to the North County Credit Union. She asked to speak to the manager, a man named Mr. Henderson, whose name she remembered from years ago. He was older now, with thinning hair and kind eyes. "I remember your husband," Henderson said, shaking her hand. "Frank Miller. He built the cabinets in my first house. A true artist. How can I help you, Mrs. Miller?" Dorothy sat down and, in a calm, even voice, told him everything. The nursing home, the forged power of attorney, the sale of her house. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She presented the facts as if she were reading from a balance sheet. Henderson listened, his expression growing more and more grim. When she was finished, he was silent for a long moment. "This is unconscionable," he said finally. "This is criminal." "I know," Dorothy said. "I need a lawyer. Not a flashy one. A shark. Someone who understands this kind of filth." Henderson nodded slowly. "I know a man. Arthur Vance. He's technically retired, but he takes on cases that interest him. He's a bulldog. Hates elder abuse more than anything. He used to be the terror of the county courthouse. Let me make a call." Arthur Vance agreed to meet her that afternoon. He was a tall, stooped man in his late 70s, with a shock of white hair and eyes that seemed to see right through you. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He walked into Dorothy's hotel suite, sat down in an armchair, and said, "Henderson told me the basics. Tell me the rest. Don't leave anything out." Dorothy told him the story again. This time, she brought out Frank's ledger. She explained the secret fund. Arthur listened, his fingers steepled, his sharp eyes never leaving her face. When she finished, he picked up the ledger and flipped through it. A slow smile spread across his thin lips. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a predator that has just caught the scent of blood. "Mrs. Miller," he said, closing the ledger, "your children have made a number of very serious mistakes. But their biggest mistake was forgetting that you were a bookkeeper." He stood up. "First, we revoke that fraudulent power of attorney. I'll have the paperwork filed by the end of the day. Second, we make you a ghost. They'll come looking for you at that nursing home. When they find you gone, they'll panic. Let them. Third, we begin a full financial autopsy of your children. People who do this sort of thing are never clean. They leave tracks. Our job is to find them." He paused at the door. "Get some rest, Mrs. Miller. The real work begins tomorrow." For the first time since Frank had died, Dorothy felt a flicker of something that resembled hope. It wasn't the warm, gentle hope of a happy ending. It was a cold, hard hope, The hope of a general on the eve of a battle she now knew she could win. She had her army, a ghost of a husband, a bulldog of a lawyer, and a war chest they never knew existed. The books were about to be balanced. The first phase of the plan was executed with military precision. Arthur Vance, true to his word, filed an emergency petition to revoke the power of attorney. He cited fraud, coercion, and provided a sworn affidavit from Dorothy detailing the circumstances under which she had signed the documents. A judge, seeing the blatant nature of the deception, signed a temporary order immediately, freezing Mark and Jessica's authority over their mother's affairs. Next, Arthur officially checked Dorothy out of Golden Meadows. The administration, faced with a furious lawyer waving a court order, complied without a fight. When Mark called the facility 2 days later for his perfunctory check-in, he was informed that his mother was no longer a resident. "What do you mean she's not a resident?" he had shouted into the phone. "Where did she go?" "Her legal counsel checked her out, sir," the administrator had replied coolly. "We have no further information." The panic on the other end of the line was palpable, even through the cheap phone in the nursing home office. This was the first tremor. Meanwhile, Dorothy, ensconced in her hotel suite, had transformed it into a command center. With Arthur's guidance and Frank's money, she began to build her case. She was no longer a victim. She was an investigator. The years she had spent hunched over ledgers, tracking invoices and reconciling accounts, had honed her mind for this exact task. She was looking for discrepancies, for the small, telltale signs of deceit that others might miss. "They sold the house to themselves," she said to Arthur during one of their daily strategy meetings. "I'm sure of it." "How do you know?" Arthur asked, peering over his reading glasses. "Mark is arrogant, but he's also greedy," Dorothy explained. "He wouldn't want to share the profit with a real buyer. He'd want all of it. He'd use a shell company, something that can't be easily traced back to him." Arthur hired a private investigator, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Carla who specialized in financial fraud. Dorothy, to Carla's surprise, didn't just hand over the problem. She directed the investigation. "Look for newly formed LLCs registered in the last 6 months," Dorothy instructed her, her voice crisp and clear over the phone. "Check the registered agent. It won't be Mark. It will be someone close to him. His business partner, maybe, or his partner's wife. Check Jessica's legal filings. She would have had to handle the paperwork. She's meticulous, but she might have gotten sloppy, thinking no one would ever look." Carla, a veteran PI who was used to dealing with emotional, scattered clients, was taken aback. It was like taking instructions from a seasoned CFO. She did as she was told. It took her less than a week. The buyer of the Miller family home was an entity called Oak Street Holdings, LLC. It had been formed 2 months prior. The sale price was $150,000 below market value. The registered agent for the LLC was the wife of Mark's primary business partner, and the legal work for both the sale and the formation of the LLC had been handled by Jessica's firm. It was a closed loop of fraud, elegant in its simplicity and breathtaking in its arrogance. They were going to do a quick cosmetic renovation and flip it for a massive profit, Carla reported back, a note of admiration in her voice. "They laundered the equity right out of your home." Dorothy felt a cold satisfaction. Her hunch had been correct. This was the cornerstone of their case. With this evidence, Arthur immediately filed a lease pendens on the property, a legal notice that it was the subject of a lawsuit. This effectively froze the title, making it impossible for Mark to sell the house until the court case was resolved. The flip was dead in the water. But Dorothy knew this wasn't enough. Halting their profit was one thing. Dismantling their lives was another. She had seen the way they lived, the casual extravagance, the constant need for more. Their greed was not just a character flaw. It was a structural weakness. She decided to press on it until it shattered. "Look into Mark's other projects," she told Carla. "The new condo development he's so proud of. The shores at Silver Lake. Frank always said Mark built his business on a foundation of debt. I want to see that foundation." This investigation was more complex. It required deep dives into public records, loan documents, and county appraisals. Carla's expenses mounted, but Dorothy paid them without question from Frank's seemingly bottomless fund. She was investing in the systematic destruction of the life her son had built on lies. The ecosystem of her vindication began to grow. It was Dorothy, the quiet CEO, directing her 2 operatives, Arthur, the legal hammer, and Carla, the covert intelligence agent. They worked in concert, their efforts fueled by Frank's posthumous provision. Dorothy would spend her days in the hotel suite, surrounded by documents. She cross-referenced names, dates, and figures. She created spreadsheets. She drew diagrams connecting shell companies and straw buyers. The fog of grief and helplessness was gone, replaced by the clarifying light of purpose. The work was not without its emotional toll. Every document, every piece of evidence was a fresh stab of betrayal. She saw her children's signatures on fraudulent papers. She saw the expensive dinners they were expensing to their companies, paid for with the proceeds of her stolen home. She saw photos Jessica had posted on social media, a smiling, carefree family trip to Italy, timestamped just 2 weeks after they had left her at Golden Meadows. The caption read, "Finally getting some much-needed family time." She would look at these things, and the cold anger would flare within her. But she wouldn't let it consume her. She would take a deep breath, turn back to her spreadsheets, and channel the anger into the next step of her plan. Carla's investigation into the shores at Silver Lake hit pay dirt. Mark had financed the development through a series of large loans from a regional bank. To secure the loans, he had been required to submit professional appraisals of the land and the projected value of the finished condos. Carla, following Dorothy's instinct, pulled the records for the appraiser Mark had used. "The guy has a history," Carla reported. "He lost his license in another state for inflating valuations. Mark has used him exclusively for the past 5 years. I spoke to a source, a disgruntled former employee at Mark's company. He said it was an open secret. Mark would tell the appraiser what number he needed, and the appraiser would produce a report to match it. That's how he secured loans that were far larger than the projects were actually worth." "And Jessica?" Dorothy asked. "She reviewed and approved all the loan agreements," Carla said. "Her signature is on every single one. She either knew or was willfully blind. In the eyes of the law, there's no difference." The snowball was now an avalanche, gathering mass and speed. They had evidence of conspiracy, wire fraud, and bank fraud. The sale of the house was a simple smash and grab. This was a complex, systematic criminal enterprise. While Dorothy was building her case, Mark and Jessica were falling apart. Their mother had vanished. Their cash cow, the house flip, was frozen. They were hemorrhaging money on a property they couldn't sell. They hired their own lawyer, a slick corporate attorney who was a friend of Jessica's. He was immediately outmaneuvered by Arthur Vance, whose old-school, bare-knuckle tactics left the younger lawyer reeling. Mark and Jessica's panic curdled into rage. They felt victimized. How could their mother do this to them? After all they had done for her? Their self-delusion was absolute. They tried to find her, calling old friends, distant relatives. No one knew anything. Dorothy, in her anonymous hotel suite, was a ghost. The major threat, from their perspective, was their mother's inexplicable rebellion. From Dorothy's perspective, the threat was that they would somehow find a way to wriggle out of the net she was so carefully weaving. She knew she had to escalate. Arthur Vance, armed with the mountain of evidence Carla had compiled, made his next move. He didn't go to the district attorney. That would be a slow, bureaucratic process. He went directly to the regional bank that held Mark's loans. He scheduled a meeting with the bank's president and its chief legal counsel. In a quiet, wood-paneled boardroom, Arthur laid out his case. He presented the fraudulent appraisals. He showed them the evidence of the appraiser's revoked license. He connected the dots to Mark's company and Jessica's legal approvals. The faces of the bank executives went from dismissive to concerned to ashen. They were not just victims of fraud. They were potentially complicit due to their own lack of due diligence. Arthur had handed them a ticking bomb. "My client, Mrs. Miller, has been grievously wronged," Arthur said, his voice calm and lethal. "But her primary concern is not with you. It is with her children. She is prepared to take this information to the federal regulators and the press. However, she is willing to forego that, provided the bank takes immediate and decisive action to rectify the situation and claw back its fraudulently obtained funds." It was a threat wrapped in an offer. The bank, seeing a way to avoid a massive scandal and regulatory nightmare, understood immediately. They had been given a way to clean up their own mess, and the target was clear: Mark Miller. While Arthur was planting his bomb in the bank's boardroom, Jessica finally managed to track her mother down. She had used her legal resources, called in favors, and pieced together a trail that led, improbably, to the landmark hotel. She appeared at Dorothy's door one evening, unannounced. She looked frantic, her usually perfect hair slightly disheveled. Dorothy, seeing her through the peephole, felt a moment's hesitation. This was her daughter. But then she saw the anger in Jessica's eyes, not remorse, and her resolve hardened. She opened the door. "Mother!" Jessica exclaimed, pushing her way into the room. "What is this? What are you doing? We've been worried sick." Dorothy closed the door and turned to face her. "No, you haven't," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "You've been worried, but not about me. You've been worried about the money." Jessica stared at her, flabbergasted. "How can you say that? We did what we did for your own good. You weren't safe. You were losing your mind." Dorothy walked over to the table, which was covered in neat stacks of documents. She picked up a single sheet of paper. It was a printout of the webpage for Oak Street Holdings, LLC. "Is this for my own good?" she asked, holding it up. "Selling my home to a shell company owned by your brother's crony for a fraction of its worth." She picked up another paper. It was a printout of Jessica's vacation photos from Instagram. "Is this you, worried sick about me?" Jessica's face flushed. The self-righteous anger drained away, replaced by a sullen defensiveness. "You don't understand. The market is complex. We were protecting your asset." "My asset?" Dorothy's voice was still quiet, but it now had an edge of steel. "That asset was your home. That was the house your father built with his own two hands. He laid every floorboard. He hung every door. You grew up in that house. You learned to walk in that living room. And you sold it. You sold it so Mark could have a new boat, and you could go to Italy." The simplicity of the accusation was more devastating than any shout. It was the truth, stripped bare of all the legal and financial jargon her children used to hide from themselves. "How could you do this to us?" Jessica whispered, her voice cracking. It was the cry of a child who has been caught and cannot comprehend the punishment. Dorothy looked at her daughter, at the stranger standing in her hotel room, and felt a profound and weary sadness. The love she had for the child Jessica had been was still there, a dull ache in her heart. But the woman before her was a stranger. "The question, Jessica," Dorothy said, turning away, "is how could you do this to me? To your father's memory?" Jessica stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. There was nothing more to say. She had come for a fight, or perhaps for a surrender from her mother. She had found a judge who had already passed sentence. She turned and walked out of the room, closing the door softly behind her. Dorothy did not watch her go. She was already looking at the next document in the stack. The confrontation was over. The endgame was about to begin. If you've made it this far into Dorothy's story, you understand the power of quiet resilience. It's a quality I admire, and it's what these stories are all about. If you feel the same, I hope you'll hit that subscribe button and join our community. Now, what would you do in this position? What does true justice for Dorothy look like? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. The bank acted with the swift, brutal efficiency of a cornered animal. Within 48 hours of Arthur Vance's meeting, they officially called all of Mark Miller's loans. It was a financial kill switch. The complex web of debt that Mark had spun to fund his developments, a web built on inflated appraisals and easy credit, was suddenly pulled taut. He was given 30 days to repay millions of dollars. It was a death sentence for his business. He had no liquidity. His assets were all tied up in half-finished projects and the now unsellable family home. He scrambled, calling his contacts, trying to secure emergency funding. But the word was already out on the street. The bank's sudden move had spooked everyone. No one would touch him. Mark and Jessica, united in their panic, pooled their remaining resources. They sold cars. Jessica cashed out her investment portfolio. They drained their savings. It wasn't nearly enough. The collapse was total and terrifyingly fast. Mark's company, Millman Properties, declared bankruptcy. The bankruptcy court, in turn, appointed a trustee to liquidate their assets to pay off the creditors, with the regional bank at the front of the line. The assets included everything: commercial properties, remaining building materials, and, of course, their own personal residences. Jessica's sprawling designer home in a gated community and Mark's custom-built mansion on the golf course were now just numbers on a ledger, destined for the auction block. This was the moment Dorothy had been planning for. This was the final test. Her strategy had not been to destroy them in a courtroom, but to let them be consumed by the very system of greed they worshipped. She hadn't pushed them off the cliff. She had simply pointed out to the world that they were standing on thin air. The day of the foreclosure auction was gray and overcast, the sky the color of dirty dishwater. The auction was held in a county administration building, a place that smelled of bureaucracy and stale coffee. It was not a glamorous venue for the end of an empire. Dorothy arrived with Arthur Vance at her side. She was wearing the same simple, elegant navy blue dress she would later wear to the final auction. She looked calm, composed, a small island of stillness in the anxious energy of the room. Mark and Jessica were there, huddled together in a corner. They looked like ghosts. The slick confidence was gone, replaced by a gaunt, haunted desperation. They had aged a decade in the last 2 months. They were there with a desperate, futile hope that a friend or a last-minute investor might show up and buy their homes, perhaps with a quiet agreement to let them rent back. They saw their mother walk in, and a flicker of hatred and disbelief crossed their faces. They couldn't comprehend her presence. In their minds, she was the cause of all of this, an unnatural force that had inexplicably ruined them. The auction began. A series of smaller assets were sold off first. Then came Jessica's house. The auctioneer began the bidding. A lawyer representing the bank opened with a low number. A few bottom-feeding investors made tentative bids. Mark and Jessica watched, their faces tight with anxiety. Then, a new voice joined the bidding. It came from a man in a dark suit near the back, who was speaking quietly into a cell phone. He raised the bid significantly. An investor countered. The man on the phone immediately raised it again. His bids were confident, immediate, relentless. He was not negotiating. He was acquiring. The investors quickly dropped out, unwilling to get into a war with someone who clearly had deep pockets and a set price in mind. Sold, the auctioneer cried, banging his gavel. The house went to the mysterious phone bidder. Jessica let out a small, strangled sob. Next came Mark's house. The exact same scenario played out. The bank opened. A few low bids. Then the man on the phone entered the fray, his voice calm and decisive, steamrolling the competition. Sold. The gavel fell again. The auctioneer then made a final announcement. For the record, the properties at 14 Willow Creek Lane and 820 Augusta Drive have both been purchased by a single entity, H.V. Holdings. Represented here today, he gestured vaguely toward the man on the phone. Mark and Jessica stared, confused. H.V. Holdings. It meant nothing to them. They had lost their homes to a faceless corporation. The humiliation was complete. Dorothy and Arthur stood up and walked out of the room. They didn't look at Mark and Jessica. In the hallway, Arthur smiled. H.V. Holdings, he said quietly. Henderson and Vance. The credit union manager and I are the only 2 directors. A little surprised we cooked up. The verdict had been delivered. Justice, in this case, was not a judge in a black robe. It was an auctioneer in a cheap suit and the cold, hard logic of the foreclosure market. The aftermath was swift. The story of Mark Miller's spectacular collapse was a brief item in the business section of the local paper. Disgraced developer loses all in bankruptcy, the headline read. It was a dry, factual account of a business failure. But Carla, with Dorothy's quiet permission, leaked the real story. She gave her entire file, the fraudulent appraisals, the shell company, the story of Golden Meadows, to a young, ambitious investigative reporter at a major online news outlet. The story that came out a week later was a bombshell. It wasn't a business story, it was a human story. Elderly mother, forced into nursing home by children, buys their houses at auction. The article was meticulously detailed, emotionally resonant, and utterly damning. It went viral. The public shame was immense and suffocating. Mark and Jessica became local pariahs. Their friends abandoned them. They were heckled at the grocery store. Their names became synonymous with greed and cruelty. The professional consequences were just as severe. The State Bar Association, prompted by the public outcry and the mountain of evidence in the article, launched an investigation into Jessica. She was disbarred within 6 months for professional misconduct and her role in the fraudulent transactions. The bank, to further distance itself from the scandal, pursued private fraud charges against Mark. He was facing years of litigation and the very real possibility of prison. They were ruined, not just financially, but socially and professionally. Their names were toxic. Dorothy watched all of this from a distance. She took no joy in their destruction. She had not acted out of a desire for revenge, but out of a need for justice. She had simply balanced the books. The world had taken care of the rest. Dorothy Miller had no intention of living in her children's houses. They were monuments to a kind of life she didn't understand and didn't want. The sprawling, sterile rooms were filled with the ghosts of bad choices. To her, they were not homes, they were assets. And she knew exactly what to do with assets. With Arthur's help, she put both houses back on the market. They sold quickly. She also, through the legal process, had the fraudulent sale of her own home voided. The title to the house on Oak Street, the house Frank built, was returned to her. She stood in the living room once more, the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. It was the same, but it was different. The betrayal had left a stain that even lemon polish couldn't remove. She knew she could never live there again. She sold it, too. She now sat on a mountain of money. There was Frank's secret fund, and now the liquidated value of 3 houses. She was, by any measure, a wealthy woman. But the money meant nothing on its own. It was just paper, as Frank had said. It needed a purpose. Her purpose had become clear to her during the long, quiet nights in the hotel. It had been born in the sickly yellow room at Golden Meadows, amidst the smells of disinfectant and despair. She met with Arthur and laid out her plan. She wanted to form a foundation, the Frank and Dorothy Miller Foundation for Elder Justice. Its mission would be to protect the vulnerable, to fight the kind of abuse she had suffered, and to provide safe, dignified housing for the elderly who had nowhere else to turn. Arthur, ever the pragmatist, drew up the papers. Dorothy, the bookkeeper, structured the finances. The foundation's first official act was an audacious one. Golden Meadows Senior Living, the site of Dorothy's lowest point, was a failing business. It was poorly managed, underfunded, and had a terrible reputation. It was for sale. The Frank and Dorothy Miller Foundation bought it. The day she walked back through those front doors, this time as the owner, was surreal. The same tired administrator sat at the desk. The same smell hung in the air. But Dorothy was not the same woman who had left in the dead of night. She began a top-to-bottom renovation. The walls were repainted in warm, cheerful colors. The thin, lumpy mattresses were replaced with comfortable new ones. The cramped, depressing common room was gutted and redesigned, with plush armchairs, well-lit reading nooks, and a real library. She hired a landscape architect to tear up the gravel parking lot and replace it with a lush, beautiful garden filled with the same kinds of roses Frank used to grow. She also cleaned house with the staff. The indifferent and the burned out were let go with generous severance packages. She kept the ones who, despite the terrible conditions, had shown genuine kindness. And she sought out Maria. She found the young aide still working double shifts at another facility, still struggling to pay her mother's medical bills. Dorothy made her another offer. Not $1,000 for an hour's work, but a new life. "I want you to run the place," Dorothy said. "I'll pay for you to get your degree in healthcare administration. I'll pay off your mother's medical debt. I don't want an employee. I want a partner. Someone who understands what it's like in there. Someone who cares." Maria, speechless and in tears, accepted. Within a year, the transformation was complete. The facility was renamed Miller House. It was no longer a place of despair, but a place of warmth and respect. The food was delicious. The activities were engaging. The residents were treated not as burdens, but as people with rich histories and stories to tell. Dorothy had taken the site of her own pain and rebuilt it into the wonderful community her children had falsely promised her. It was the ultimate act of construction, a testament to the Miller way, building something good and lasting from the ground up. Almost 2 years after the auction, a woman appeared at the front desk of Miller House. She was thin, dressed in simple, inexpensive clothes. Her face was worn, stripped of the hard, polished certainty it once had. It was Jessica. She had been through the crucible, the public shaming, the disbarment, the bankruptcy. She had lost everything: her career, her house, her husband, who had left her when the money ran out. She had been humbled by life in a way she had never thought possible. She asked to see her mother. Dorothy met her in the new cafeteria, a bright, airy room overlooking the garden. Jessica didn't make excuses. She didn't try to justify what she had done. She simply sat down, looked her mother in the eye, and apologized. The apology was quiet, broken, and utterly sincere. "I was a monster, Mom," she whispered, tears rolling down her cheeks. "There's no other word for it. I was so afraid of losing everything I had built. I threw away the only thing that ever mattered." She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't ask for money. She seemed to ask for nothing. She just wanted to say the words, to own the ugliness of what she had done. Dorothy listened. She felt the old, aching love for her child surface, but it was tempered with the hard-won wisdom of the past few years. Forgiveness was not a simple transaction. She didn't say, "I forgive you," she didn't say, "It's okay." She simply pushed a cup of coffee across the table toward her daughter. "The visiting hours are posted on the door," Dorothy said, her voice gentle but firm. "The coffee in the new cafeteria is quite good." It wasn't an embrace, but it was an open door. It was not a restoration of the old relationship, but an offer of a new, more honest beginning, one built on truth instead of lies. Jessica nodded, wiping her eyes, understanding the gift she had just been given. Mark never came. His pride, or his shame, was too great. He disappeared into the anonymity of his failure, a bitter ghost haunting the ruins of his own life. Dorothy spent her afternoons in the garden at Miller House. She had a favorite bench, one that caught the morning sun. She didn't live at the facility. She still maintained her own quiet, private apartment nearby. But this was her life's work now. She would watch the residents walking through the rose bushes, reading on the benches, laughing with one another. People who, like her, had been at risk of being forgotten, now living with dignity and joy. One sunny afternoon, she sat on her bench, feeling the warmth on her face. She held a small, framed photograph in her lap. It was an old, faded picture of her and a young Frank, taken 55 years ago. They were standing on the bare, wooden subfloor of their first home, the unfinished frame rising around them like the skeleton of a great beast. Frank, young and strong, had his arm around her, a hammer in his other hand, a wide, confident grin on his face. She, young and full of hope, was holding a ledger. She smiled, a real, gentle smile. She ran her thumb over the image of her late husband. He had always been the builder, the man who created things from nothing with his bare hands. And she had always been the bookkeeper, the woman who made sure every column added up, that every debt was paid, and that everything was in its proper place. Together, they had balanced the books one last time.